This series was made possible thanks to the generosity of these patrons and from the likes and watch time of viewers like you. Thank you for your support.
Read the disclaimers, and please use common sense.
A few weeks ago, I came across an absolute time capsule while cleaning up my bedroom in order to move back to college, as you do. It was a script from nearly 4 years ago, specifically a script from my review of Studio Series Bone Crusher, and it brought back a lot of emotions, like where I was emotionally and what I thought of collecting and what I thought of toys themselves at the time, and even what I thought of the Transformers fandom, because I was extremely new. Transformers had been something I'd always notionally appreciated because I knew of it and knew a lot of people liked it, but it's never something I considered myself a big fan of. And that is until, exactly a year prior to that very moment, when I went into Target and saw a Titans Return Cosmos on the wall. Granted, I didn't end up picking that figure up, but it did light something in me. And while I'd like to think that since then I've changed a lot in terms of what I think of Transformers and what I like to collect and what I think of the Transformers fandom itself, one thing hasn't changed in terms of my outlook on Transformers: the oversaturation of G1. And while I could wax poetics all day about how I feel so disrespected, really, there's no better sign of how little we matter to the Transformers franchise than the fact that I could count the number of Unicron Trilogy figures released over the Prime Wars and WFC Trilogy on one hand. Let's see here, there was that retool from Combine Wars Megatron into Armada Megatron that we don't like to talk about, even less than Bruno. Titans Return Broadside into Tidal Wave. Then there was the Action L Right retools like Siege Ultra Magnus into Galaxy Upgrade Optimus Prime, and another one in Generation Select's Hotshot, which was retooled from WFC Hound. Do you see my problem? Sure, the things we want are out there, but not only are they few and far between, but they're also either expensive or exclusives. And let me be clear, this is no condemnation towards the G1ers in the community. The ones that I have met are genuinely kind and pretty chill about what they love. They might have a preference towards G1, but they don't think that's all the franchise should be, and they're overall pretty nice guys to be around. Having said that, I didn't have that perspective when I started collecting, and in fact, I kinda had a hate boner for G1 just because I assumed that the G1 oversaturation from the Prime Wars had been the status quo for longer than it really had been. These days, I've really softened up towards the G1 aesthetic, and in fact, some of the figures I am looking forward to the most this year are heavily inspired by the Sunbow cartoon models, but yeah. Variety has been a bit of an issue recently. In fact, I think we have some common ground here. The way I feel about this whole lack of Unicron Trilogy stuff is probably the same way you felt in the mid to late 2000s when all that was available for G1 stuff was either heavily stylized versions of the characters or just repaints of whatever was hanging around from yesteryear. And the worst part about this cycle is that, well, it never really needed to be a cycle in the first place. So, that begs the question, if Thrilling 30 was able to figure out how to get multiple continuities with varied aesthetics into the same toy line without having it clash horribly. What's the problem with modern toy lines? Why can't they have multiple continuities in a single line? Well, here's the thing about Legacy. I think they all realized that they were a bit burnt out on G1, and they came to the most obvious conclusion of all that, really, there wasn't a problem in the first place, which really should have been the takeaway from all those years ago. We can have characters from multiple continuities coexisting in a single line. Now, it's not always going to be a perfect fit, especially for more stylized series like animated, but they have heard our feedback, and they are at least planning on future releases for more stylized shows to be closer to their on-screen model than, say, Bulkhead and RC were. And with that format change in mind for Generations, I've decided to change the format of this review series. I've been getting a bit sick and tired of doing videos in the style of Dr. Lockdown, where I begin and end every episode in front of the camera, and then fill in everything in between with lightbox footage, but I'm still going to try and keep lightbox footage in here. It'll fade in over whatever I'm saying on camera whenever I need to illustrate a point that I can't really make from this perspective. So, let's see how the first step into Unicron Trilogy updates fares for Hasbro. Salutations, denizens of the internet! I'm Firebite27, and let us commence our analysis of Transformers Legacy Velocitron Speedia 500 Cybertron Universe Override! As is tradition with this review series, we begin in vehicle mode, where I kinda have a problem with Override. You see, the front of it looks a bit too big, while the back looks way too small. Like someone bisected a concept car and a clown car and then Frankenstein the rest together. And we do have one final issue to cover, and that is, this thing is very gappy. Like, especially from the sides and the back. Those are the two main areas where this thing just completely disintegrates. And we probably could have fixed it and the proportional issues at the same time if we had maybe, like, made the back bigger or, like, made the front smaller, but that would have probably ruined something with the robot mode in terms of its proportions, or maybe fixed them in the case of the articulation in some regards, but we'll get to that when we get to that. And those are the only problems I really even have with the vehicle mode, because I think other than that, it's pretty much perfect. Well, at least in terms of capturing a Unicron Trilogy design, because really, every single detail is there and captured astonishingly well. Like, really, there's so much stuff here that seems to exist for sheer decadence. Like, what the heck is the purpose of these blue little thingies here on the, I guess, the windshield? I don't know what they are. What about these little knitting needles here in between on, like, the middle of the hood? What about these vents on the back, and, like, what purpose do they serve? And what's with kind of the diamond shape on the rear spoilers, if that's what that is? What's, I don't know, it's so cool. It doesn't matter what they are, and they are glorious. Best of all, this really captures the spirit of anime at the time Cybertron was released, where the mecha genre was still alive and kicking and influencing anime beyond just its own genre. And before it all tragically fell to the overwhelming weight of isekai and idol anime. And nothing against the isekai genre, I do love me some Konosuba, but it is oversaturated. Kinda like G1! And the best part is that I kind of feel as though this figure not only captures Cybertron and the essence of anime at that time, but also like everything that I like about Transformers and science fiction from that era in general. It's really cool, looks unique as hell, and like I wouldn't mistaken it for a car from any other futuristic series, like I guess Blade Runner. Not to mention that this also feels very, very tokusatsu. I know I keep bringing that up, but it's for good reason. The front of it kind of reminds me of the Trideron from Kamen Rider Drive. Just look at it. It's almost identical, like scarily identical. And just in general, it's an awesome sci-fi car. And it really helps tie it back to something that I think they were trying to achieve when they originally conceived this figure. If you don't know, they were originally making this figure and Cosmos retools of previously released figures. Specifically, for Override, they're planning on making her out of SS-86 Hot Rod. And for Cosmos, they're going to retool him from Buzzworthy Bumblebee, specifically Origins Bumblebee. And while I am glad that they ultimately got to be their own molds, I will admit that I do kind of see where they were coming from when they had the idea to basically retool Hot Rod into Override. Turns out their vehicle modes do share a bit more in common than you might think. Both are primarily red, and while both of them might be very different in overall design, they are both trying to represent the same thing. What is the future of automotives going to look like? This is the perspective of what they would look like in the future of 2004. Whereas Hot Rod was what they were supposed to look like in the future of 1984. Or I guess 86, but that's too specific. You get the idea. They were both meant to be futuristic cars from the perspective of the time they were released in. And for that, I can totally get it. It also really nails the feel of a toy. It's nice and dense. It feels like the plastic wouldn't get damaged if a kid yeeted it down a driveway. It's just nice. But the most important thing that this figure nails is the aesthetic. Because the Unicron trilogy was full of unique designs. And a big part of the reason why a lot of those retools don't really gel with me is because, well, they sacrificed that unique look in order to get it out of a completely different figure that was never supposed to have it in the first place. And in all honesty, I can let a lot of these problems slide because not only are they problems with other figures, but it's also the first attempt at tackling such a unique design. Technically second attempt, but we're getting off track here. It's meant to be a first stab at more Unicron trilogy representations, and I am extremely glad that it even happened in the first place. And so here she is next to my last review, Buzzworthy Pterosaur, another exclusive that I purchased recently, Reckoned Rule Twin Twist, another Fembot that I got recently, Studio Series Bumblebee RC, and of course, a standard Qtama, standard can of sparkling water, and Fraudside. So, overall, I will admit that this is an extremely flawed vehicle mode, but I still like it. Mostly because of what it means to me, and also because all of those sacrifices do actually result in a pretty good robot mode. So let's get to it. And here we have the robot mode, where I will admit that if you aren't super into the whole Japanese super robot aesthetic, there's not going to be much here for you. I love that aesthetic, but I'll admit it was an acquired taste and one that I had to watch a lot of Power Rangers to acquire.
You will do nothing! I am going to make my beautiful monster a little bigger!
And we do have a few other issues that we'll get to in due time, but, well, at first glance, this thing looks amazing! I love how it looks. It looks perfect.
Use better descriptors than the word perfect, Ryan.
The brass, the red, and the white all look powerful next to each other. And the best part is that most of the details here are painted. You just know if they had made her a deluxe, she'd be as well painted as a warrior class figure. Okay, no, not that bad, but that bad. And on top of that, they even adapted her weapon from Transformers Cybertron, and on top of that, and get ready for your mind to be blown, it's fully compatible with the actual Cyber Keys. I know, right? That's amazing. So if you already have one, or I mean the original Override, it's actually going to add some surprising value to this new one. Of course, they didn't feature the whole entire cannons flipping out gimmick, but really, they probably didn't have the budget for that. And we'll get to that too in due time, but honestly, this thing looks amazing. And it really does pose amazing too. Like, it looks dynamic in every pose it's in, and even though there is a few limits to that articulation, I still really like it. And on top of that, like, it, again, feels good in hand. Like, a problem that I'll have occasionally with Transformers is that whenever I want to shake one, actually give me a second to grab one, whenever I want to pose it, this is the issue I'll often run into. The joints are too loose out of the box. However, with Override, that's not an issue really. And the transformation that it took to get here was really fun. Granted, a bit basic for what we're paying for, but still really fun nonetheless. And like, from most angles, none of the parts here are hollow. The legs are the only exception, and that's understandable, but like, that's really impressive and really shows the quality on display here. None of the hollowness is visible. One more minor annoyance before I get into actual problems here, and that's the fact that, well, they painted over her eyes when she has a light piping block in the back of her head. But again, I begrudgingly understand that problem because, well, she had blue eyes in the cartoon, and the light piping had to be red because it was on the same sprue as the cockpit. And what a cockpit it is, and what a centerpiece for the chest piece it makes. Damn, it is so cool. I just love how it looks, and while I will admit, again, this isn't for everyone, a cockpit chestplate look isn't everyone's cup of tea, same with this whole super robot aesthetic, I love it! And like, same with the details that appear again for no reason. Like, what purpose do these little things serve? Like, they kind of, I don't know what they do, but they look cool. What about these things here? And like, here's another cool thing about it. They actually painted the details all the way through. Like, I'll get to this in a bit, but they could not do that out of a deluxe budget. They definitely would have like neglected the part over here, or like left it out so they didn't have to paint it. But no, they really went all out here. And tell me, what kind of deluxe would seriously get a paint budget this extravagant in this day and age? Seriously, I think that alone does a great job of justifying the asking price of $35. Or does it? Oh boy, here comes the question I've been dreading answering, but is this figure really worth the same amount as a Voyager-like bulkhead? In fact, is it worth more than such a Voyager? Because, like, unlike other figures that use that inflated price tag in order to get, like, a one-up on engineering, when it comes to this figure, this really doesn't have the same parts count as something like SS-86 Hot Rod, or, like, Siege Astrotrain. Or I guess more topically, Commander Class Motormaster. I mean, this thing is worth its price point, and I ultimately feel that they both are, but I feel it's for different reasons. When it comes to Menasor, he has the parts count that justifies this, and also all the expensive mechanisms that would too. Like, there's so many ratchet joints on everything, even in places where they normally shouldn't be, like the wrist swivels. However, with Override, what I think we might be paying for, on top of all that paint, is, well, the fact that it's not a retool. As I mentioned earlier, there was originally going to be the fact that this was a retool of SSA-6 Hot Rod, and while I am glad that they didn't do it, I do have to wonder though, how far did they make it into the process of retooling the figure from Hot Rod to Override? Because if they made it pretty far along the process, that means they spent a lot of money and time working on a figure that they ultimately didn't release. So, like, they've even admitted that they did produce this figure with only 4 molds instead of the usual 12, so that makes me ask, did they actually have the budget to make it a new mold, or is it just a last-minute change that they had to scramble in order to do? And it would make sense because there are a few issues here with the articulation that kind of make it feel like a rush job. Maya, you discussed that, so I can just go into this.
In robot mode, Override has a swivel at the head, universal movement at the shoulders, bicep rotation, elbows bend, rotation at the wrists, a pitiful waist rotation, universal movement at the hips, thigh rotation, knee bend well over 90 degrees, and ankles can tilt forwards, backwards, and sideways.
Thank you, Maya. Honestly, I don't know if the articulation really justifies this. Like, I think if they had maybe if this was a rush job, maybe they would have found a better way to incorporate the waist swivel instead of having it be blocked by the back flap. In fact, apart from locking in the wheels in the back for vehicle mode, it doesn't really serve a purpose, so I don't get why it's there. Having said that, though, I do kind of understand where people are coming from. There are some factors that make it feel like it's less than the sum of its parts, but I still think that it goes above the price point that would be demanded by a deluxe, and it's worth paying more than a deluxe for. Here it is next to my last review, Pterosaur, next to Twin Twist, next to RC, and of course next to a standard Kutama, standard can of sparkling water, and Broadside. Also, this is just a note from the Byte of the future, as in Byte, who recorded the size comparisons a few days after he recorded all the footage for the rest of the video. You get the idea. And technically, when I'm getting to these size comparisons, I realize that no, the argument that she's really just an overpriced deluxe really doesn't hold up, since, well, she's not much shorter than most modern Voyagers. And on top of that, she's much taller than most modern Deluxes. This is a modern Voyager, so I don't think that criticism holds much water. On top of that, I think just compared to a lot of modern Voyagers, she just feels lesser to an extent. And maybe that's because she was rushed a little, as I covered earlier. Thank you. And honestly, whether or not it was worth paying $35 for isn't the question I set out to answer at the start of this episode. The question I set out to answer was, is this enough? Is this finally a good first step forward for Transformers based on the Unicron trilogy? And more importantly, getting updated figures of characters from the Unicron trilogy. After all this, I'm going to say that yes, this is an amazing first step on that road. I don't have Metroplex yet, and probably won't get him, but that Armada Starscream is shaping up to be pretty cool, and Metroplex himself is looking really nice. So yeah, I'm confident in the future of Unicron Trilogy Chug figures. And maybe we'll even see that one Armada Optimus Prime they teased years and years ago. So overall, I am really happy with this, and the fact that it exists, and even in spite of all of its problems, I'm more than happy to award it with an 8.5 out of 10. Go out and try and find it if you can, and please don't pay scalper prices for it. And with that being said, this is Firebite27, over and out.